climate as a subject of international negotiations, believe it or not, is in its 30th year now. Over these 3 decades, we have watched with a kind of awe at the rate at which, climate impacts have intensified and multiplied. This time, while articulation of the need and urgency of climate action has evolved, it has consistently rested on the need for strong institutional planks. Given the cross-cutting nature of climate impacts, there has long been a recognition that these strong institutional frameworks are necessary to be able to direct a coordinated effort that brings together economic, political, financial, legal, and behavioral aspects of climate action within a well put together framework. Today, we'll try to cut through the mist around this institutional schematic when it comes to climate action in India. The objective will be to try and take stock of where institutional capacity has come over the last few decades, what we've achieved, the hits and the misses.
First glance, it looks like things are doing okay. I mean, things are quite fine. We have a strong bureaucracy. We have these command and control structures in government. We have functioning markets. We have decision-making that's more or less in line with popular will. And so things function the way you'd expect an average government to function. Right? So why do we need to be talking about institutions above and beyond when it comes to climate change? And that, I think, has to do really with the nature of the problem, because climate change is a problem that's beyond, looks and feels very different than other problems. Right? So you need an institution there that is capable of processing not only the climate, carbon, atmospheric physics angle, but also the economics and also the social and political dynamics, and creating some sort of long-term plan. So that's the basic case for why you need to be thinking about institutions specifically when it comes to climate change. And it's very different from run-of-the-mill governance and the state.
So where I'm coming from is basically reflecting that a partnership approach and literally a very multi-stakeholder driven approach will be required when we talk about climate change, when we talk about climate action, irrespective of which level of institution we talk about. The consultation and the voices need to be really apparent.
The big thing, or the most important thing that all of us want, is a transition, in this climate debate, right? Transition is both about mitigation, like deep decarbonization or deeply decarbonized future, but it's also about a much more resilient, like climate resilient economy, climate resilient people. So that is what is the outcome that we want, right? And how do we really reach that outcome? Again, there are two big kind of levers. One is the markets and the other is institutions, right? So the markets are also in fact institutions, right? So they're also known as institutions, but the kind of institution we are talking about here is not really markets. We're talking about, different institutions that kind of facilitate markets. They are so not markets themselves, but institutions that facilitate market. Essentially, what it also implies that wherever markets have failed, and climate changes are like a super example of that. It is a problem due to market failure, and that is where institutions step in to correct this market failure in some way. Institutions are probably this bridge between what that high level the discussions were happening and the people on the ground. Actual transition, because that is our ultimate objective. So the question is also always what is the action that we are talking about in this whole institutional debate. And that is, in fact, because institutions are so diverse, they're so complicated for us to understand, that action points are actually, they appear to be many times very theoretical in nature. And somehow we have to find a way to even communicate this better. That this theoretical, high level, fun-do things that we're talking about in institutions, they're actually very critical. But we have to find a vocabulary where we are able to communicate. What does it mean? We can keep on saying it's very important, doesn't matter. Listeners will always, and our audience and the stakeholders will always say, well, you are talking theory at the end of the day. So what are these core action points that we are talking about? And then the moment we talk about this core action point, that is the moment when feasibility starts emerging.
Basically, the idea is there has to be a point in government, a node in government that is constantly asking the climate question and asking that across ministries and across agencies and so on.
I think with climate action and even actions related to building that resilience, building that adaptation. We've now seen that happening across the board in definitely a much more higher pace than was before, right? So what we've seen is companies as well shift from having sustainability departments to setting those targets within procurement, within logistics, within operations. And this is happening at an increasing pace, right? Earlier, what you would see is all the work would happen within sustainability. They would be at loggerheads or pushing for other departments to work, much as what Aditya has just described with the government level. Right? But this is now changing within companies. You see those metrics being applied even to different departments, at least the lighthouses of the best practices that we see in the country, right? And you can only ask for that so that others can replicate and learn from that.
I think, well, it will always be, incentivized by consumption. So I don't think we can't change the fundamentals of market. Markets will operate the way they do always. The question is always about, so in this transition process, the question is, does the top level of, let's say, decision makers, do they understand that this is about the economy of the future? Do they understand this, right? Or do they imbibe this, right? For example, Aditya gave example, very interesting, important example of NDRC in China, right? I mean, this whole drive towards, solar and everything and greening in China is not at all about climate. Let's stop fooling ourselves. It is about capturing the global market, the global value chain. So they saw 20 years back that critical minerals would be something extremely important for manufacturing of solar panels, which is going to rule the world. So let us get all the mines everywhere in the world which produce critical minerals. They thought this 20 years back, because they have already been thinking about the economy of the future, right? When you go to Europe, who talks about this carbon thing? Everybody, the European finance ministers talk about it. The European Bank chief talks about it. Now they've already instituted a border carbon adjustment tax, which is essentially an institutional mechanism. They've already done it. Why they've done it? Because they know this is the economy of the future. It's as simple as that, right? The question is, when will we start framing the climate debate? The question is, first, do we as a civil society, do we realize that, well, it's time, co-benefit has served its purpose, it's fine. It's high time we move to this, this sort of a mainstreaming economic transformation kind of narrative. It's high time, because once we move in that direction, then my hope is we will be able to probably better convince the policymakers about this whole thing, that this is think about the economy of the future. Don't keep talking about these few co-benefits here and there in the larger narrative. Your climate action is not about co-benefit, it is about economic transformation.
I think it's incontroversial to say that it's very low on the priority list, right? So somebody ran an analysis and compared the manuscripts of the BJP and the Congress prior to a 2019 election. It was Asim Prakash and somebody else, and they basically found that less than some infinitesimally small amount was devoted to it, and both parties, right? So it's not like it's something like 0.3% of the lines or something like that. It was ridiculous. But I think this larger question, like how do you mainstream this narrative of climate politics and all that, it's worth like just stepping back and looking at it more broadly, right? So how has climate become a central narrative in politics in global experience? And one of the key things always is what they call the issue attention cycle. So you have some big apocalyptic phenomenon like Australia burning or the wildfires in California or something, which creates these big visuals. But it seems to me that you need to have a congruence and an interlock between these three levels to actually really push the conversation, right? So what you'll get from the international level is rising concern about climate. And you have a whole lot of concern about industrial competitiveness and carbon and border adjustment taxes. You'll have legislatures that may be able to push back on the status quo fossil fuel sort of incumbent interests. And you'll have enough sort of popular civil society discussion that makes it worthwhile for politicians to look at it. So in the absence of these three things, if any one of these things is missing, you're probably not going to get the sort of transformational change that you're looking for over the span of, say, 10 15 years or 2035 being a time horizon to peak for a lot of European countries. You probably won't get there. For developing countries, say 2050. I mean, Vaibhav's analysis is actually a really eye-opening account of how to get to how to get to net zero. If you don't have these three things interlocking, it doesn't seem to me like even those sort of best case scenarios are in the realm of possibility. Forget about if it's practical or not. I don't think it's even possible to conceive.
It's not like these efforts have not been, being made so far, but I do agree with Vaibhav entirely, right? If we're going to count on the civil society organizations alone, right? Now I'm separating civil society, all of us versus, like, say, that particular segment to play this role of really, sort of beating drums and sort of hugging trees and saying, let's do this for the climate. I fully agree that's not getting us very far. In fact, in our current country environment, it may be actually counterproductive, right? Those voices are maybe sometimes being further clamped, not the other way around. They aren't really amplifying or putting more urgency on the action. I'm inclined to agree. I just feel like from a going concern perspective, if the economy has to grow, then that is where the conversation needs to happen. Right? That's the downside of not addressing it. That's the downside of not gearing your both financial system, your taxonomy, all of that to invest in the future. So I'm definitely not of the opinion that it's organizations, at that level who can be the leaders in this. I think they're an important voice to have on the table from the purpose of consultation and inclusion, because that is where if impacts are being felt.
Corporations need to sort of infuse climate and sustainability concerns into each of their verticals and stuff. I was doing some fieldwork a few weeks ago and I walked into this municipal commissioner's office. And this is a middling, this is nowhere on the scale of what we were talking about so far, right? And we were having a conversation. At some point I said, so how are you going to respond to climate change? I just brought it up. We were talking about all sorts of issues and I was just very bluntly asked him this question. And he said, fundamentally, the problem is the ocean has too much plastic and we get too much plastic on our beaches. At which point I was a bit stunned. I was like, but that's one part of it. But then he's on a highly sensitive sea erosion prone district, municipality. And so it was, and then it really struck me the scale of what we're asking for when we say that these institutions need to change. Like the amount of information, the amount of complexity you're trying to cram into everyday bureaucrats and everyday company managers for them to be making smart day-to-day decisions. Sometimes I feel like it's too much of an ask because it's completely rewriting it. There's no space for mediocrity in those jobs anymore, right? Like you can't just be doing your thing on a day-to-day basis and just sort of coasting by. You really need to be paying attention to something that's completely outside your universe. So that's A, why institutions are important, and B, also why it's so hard to sort of reform right through. Yeah.